July 19, 64 AD. Rome is burning. Flames devour the eternal city, turning marble palaces into ash, reducing entire districts to smoldering ruins. And somewhere, high above the chaos, a mad emperor plays his fiddle, singing of Troy's destruction while his people scream in agony below. This is the story we've been told for nearly 2,000 years. The story of Nero, history's ultimate monster. A man so depraved, so cruel, that he'd rather make music than save his burning capital. But what if I told you that almost everything you think you know about Nero is wrong? What if the fiddle hadn't even been invented yet? What if Nero wasn't even in Rome when the fire started? What if the emperor history painted as a monster was actually trying to help? Today, we're going to tear apart 2 millennia of propaganda, dig through the archaeological evidence, and uncover the real story of one of history's most misunderstood rulers. By the end of this video, you'll question everything you thought you knew about power, propaganda, and how history gets written by the winners. So grab some snacks, settle in, and let's unravel the mystery of Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, the emperor who may have been Rome's savior, not its destroyer. To understand Nero, we first need to understand the world that created him. And trust me, it's more twisted than any soap opera you've ever watched. By 37 AD, Rome controlled most of the known world. But ruling this vast empire came at a cost, and that cost was often paid in blood, betrayal, and madness. Enter the Julio-Claudian dynasty, a family so dysfunctional that even reality TV producers would say maybe tone it down a bit. Augustus, the first emperor, had no sons. So power passed through a web of adoptions, marriages, and murders that would make Game of Thrones look like a children's bedtime story. You had Tiberius, who retreated to an island to indulge in unspeakable acts. Caligula, who allegedly made his horse a consul and declared war on Neptune. And Claudius, who was poisoned by his own wife to make way for her son. That son? Nero. Nero was born Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus on December 15, 37 AD. And from day one, his life was shaped by one woman's ruthless ambition, his mother, Agrippina the Younger. Agrippina wasn't just any Roman matron. She was the great-granddaughter of Augustus, the sister of Caligula, and the wife of Emperor Claudius. She was also, by all accounts, absolutely terrifying. When Nero was just 3 years old, Caligula exiled Agrippina for plotting against him. Mother and son lived in poverty until Claudius recalled them. But Agrippina had learned a valuable lesson: in Rome, you either played the game of power, or you died. So when she married her uncle Claudius in 49 AD, yes, her uncle, because Roman politics was complicated, she had one goal: put her son on the throne. She convinced Claudius to adopt Nero, making him heir to the throne ahead of Claudius's own biological son, Britannicus. She arranged for the best tutors money could buy, including the philosopher Seneca and the military commander Burrus. And when Claudius started having second thoughts about the succession, well, let's just say that mushroom stew became very popular in the imperial household. Claudius died in 54 AD, allegedly from poison administered by his wife. Agrippina had gotten her wish. At just 16 years old, Nero became emperor of Rome. Here's where the story gets interesting, because for the first 5 years of Nero's reign, Rome experienced what historians call a golden age. Under the guidance of Seneca and Burrus, young Nero proved to be surprisingly competent. He reduced taxes, expanded citizen rights, gave the Senate more power, and even banned capital punishment. He built theaters, sponsored gladiatorial games, and initiated massive public works projects. The economy boomed. The borders were secure. For a brief, shining moment, it looked like Rome had found its perfect emperor. But there was a problem: Agrippina. Having spent years maneuvering her son onto the throne, she expected to rule through him. She wanted to sit in on Senate meetings, control imperial appointments, and basically run the empire from behind the scenes. Nero, now tasting real power for the first time, wasn't having it. The relationship between mother and son became a battle of wills. Agrippina threatened to support Britannicus's claim to the throne. Nero responded by slowly pushing her out of power. She tried to maintain control through manipulation and guilt. He started ignoring her advice entirely. Then, in 55 AD, Britannicus died suddenly at a dinner party. The official cause was an epileptic seizure. But given the family history, many suspected poison. Tacitus, our primary source for this period, heavily implies that Nero was responsible, though he provides no concrete evidence. Whether or not Nero killed his stepbrother, one thing was clear: the golden boy was starting to show his darker side. The turning point came in 59 AD, when Nero decided to solve his mother problem permanently. The story of Agrippina's murder reads like something out of a dark comedy. First, Nero tried to kill her with a collapsible boat designed to sink during a pleasure cruise. Agrippina survived by swimming to shore. Then he sent assassins to finish the job at her villa. When they arrived, Agrippina reportedly pointed to her womb and said, "Strike here," for this bore Nero. The murder of Agrippina marked a point of no return. Nero had crossed a line that even Romans, accustomed to imperial violence, found shocking. Matricide was considered one of the worst crimes imaginable, a violation of the most fundamental bonds of society. But here's where we need to be careful. Most of what we know about this period comes from historians writing decades or even centuries later, under different emperors who had every reason to make Nero look bad. Tacitus, our main source, was writing during the reign of Trajan, who explicitly positioned himself as the anti-Nero. Suetonius wrote even later, during Hadrian's reign, and loved a good scandalous story whether it was true or not. Were these historians recording facts, or were they repeating propaganda? That's the question that haunts everything we think we know about Nero. July 19, 64 AD. It started in the Circus Maximus, in the shops that lined the great arena. Rome was in the middle of summer, the city was tinder-dry, and the wind was blowing strong. Fire was nothing new in Rome. The city was a maze of narrow streets, wooden buildings, and open flames for cooking and lighting. Fires broke out regularly. But this one was different. This one didn't stop. For 6 days and 7 nights, the fire raged through Rome. It consumed entire districts, destroyed temples that had stood for centuries, and left hundreds of thousands of people homeless. When it finally burned itself out, 10 of Rome's 14 districts had been damaged, and 3 had been completely destroyed. The Great Fire of Rome was one of the worst disasters in the city's history. And naturally, people wanted someone to blame. Let's deal with the most famous part of the story first: Nero playing his fiddle while Rome burned. The fiddle, or violin, wasn't invented until the 16th century, 1500 years after Nero's death. So right off the bat, we know this part of the story is impossible. But what about a lyre? Romans did have those. Could Nero have been playing a lyre while Rome burned? Our earliest sources for the fire, Tacitus, Pliny the Elder, and Cassius Dio, don't mention Nero playing any instrument during the fire. The fiddle story appears much later, in medieval texts that were already centuries removed from the events. But here's the really interesting part: according to Tacitus, Nero wasn't even in Rome when the fire started. He was at his villa in Antium, about 35 miles away. When he received word of the fire, he rushed back to the city and immediately began organizing relief efforts. So how did we get the fiddle story? It's probably a corruption of a different tale. Suetonius mentions that Nero once performed a song about the burning of Troy while watching Rome burn, but he doesn't specify when this happened, and it might have been during a different, smaller fire. Over time, this story got conflated with the Great Fire, and the song became a fiddle, and history became legend. So what did Nero actually do during the Great Fire? According to the historical sources, and remember, these are sources that generally hate Nero, he actually handled the crisis pretty well. When Nero returned to Rome, he opened his own palaces to house refugees. He organized food supplies for the displaced. He brought in grain from outside the city to prevent famine. He set up temporary shelters in public buildings and even in his own gardens. After the fire was extinguished, Nero launched a massive rebuilding program. But here's where things get controversial. He used some of the cleared land to build his new palace, the Domus Aurea or Golden House. The Golden House was enormous. It covered somewhere between 100 and 300 acres in the heart of Rome. It featured artificial lakes, gardens, and a 120-foot-tall statue of Nero himself. It was, by any measure, an ostentatious display of imperial power. Critics argued that Nero had started the fire himself to clear land for his palace. They pointed to the Golden House as evidence of his selfishness and megalomania. But modern historians are more skeptical of these claims. First, the fire destroyed some of Nero's own property, including parts of his existing palace. Second, the new building codes Nero implemented after the fire, wider streets, height restrictions, fire-resistant materials, suggest someone who was trying to prevent future disasters, not cause them. Third, and most importantly, there's no contemporary evidence that anyone actually blamed Nero for starting the fire. The accusations seem to have emerged later, as part of a broader effort to demonize his memory. But if Nero didn't start the fire, someone had to take the blame. And that's where we get to one of the darkest chapters in Roman history, the persecution of the Christians. Christianity was still a new and poorly understood religion in Nero's time. Christians were seen as members of a weird Jewish sect who refused to worship the emperor and spread strange ideas about love and forgiveness. They were perfect scapegoats. According to Tacitus, Nero blamed the Christians for starting the fire and launched a brutal persecution. Christians were crucified, burned alive, and fed to wild animals in public spectacles. Some were covered in pitch and used as human torches to light Nero's gardens. This persecution was horrific, but we need to understand it in context. Religious persecution was unfortunately common in the ancient world. What made Nero's persecution of Christians notable was its scale and cruelty, but also the fact that it backfired spectacularly. Instead of convincing Romans that the Christians were responsible for the fire, the persecution made people sympathetic to the Christians. Tacitus, no friend to Christianity, wrote that even though the Christians were guilty of deserving punishment, people felt pity for them because they were being destroyed not for the public good but to satisfy one man's cruelty. The persecution of Christians under Nero became a foundational story for early Christianity. It established the template of Christians as innocent victims of imperial tyranny. And it ensured that when Christians eventually came to power, they would remember Nero as their greatest enemy. Here's something that might surprise you. Nero wasn't just interested in power and luxury. He was also genuinely passionate about the arts. Nero loved to perform. He sang, acted, played the lyre, and wrote poetry. He competed in chariot races and participated in Greek-style athletic competitions. He even established his own Olympic-style games, the Neronia, which emphasized artistic as well as athletic competition. For a Roman emperor, this was scandalous. Roman aristocrats were supposed to be dignified, serious, and focused on military and political affairs. They weren't supposed to prance around on stage like common actors. But Nero didn't just perform, he was apparently pretty good at it. While his court flattery makes it hard to judge objectively, there are hints that he had genuine artistic talent. He studied with the best teachers, practiced constantly, and took his performances seriously. The problem was that Nero's artistic ambitions clashed with Roman expectations of imperial behavior. When he performed in public, audiences were essentially forced to applaud, creating an atmosphere where genuine artistic merit was impossible to assess. Nero's love of performance wasn't just a personal quirk, it reflected a deeper cultural divide within the Roman Empire. Rome had conquered Greece, but Greek culture had conquered Rome. The educated Roman elite spoke Greek, read Greek literature, and admired Greek art and philosophy. But they also maintained a complex relationship with Greek culture, admiring it while also seeing it as somewhat effeminate and decadent. Nero threw himself wholeheartedly into Greek culture. He preferred Greek-style competitions to Roman gladiatorial games. He loved Greek theater, Greek music, and Greek athletic competitions. In 67 AD, he even traveled to Greece to compete in the Olympic Games. This trip to Greece was both the high point and the beginning of the end of Nero's reign. He competed in chariot racing, singing, and acting competitions. He won over 1,800 prizes, though given that he was the emperor, the judging might not have been entirely impartial. But while Nero was playing in Greece, Rome was falling apart. Military rebellions were breaking out in the provinces. The treasury was running low. The Senate was plotting against him. And Nero seemed more interested in his next performance than in governing the empire. It's around this time that the stories about Nero become truly bizarre. He allegedly married his male lover Sporus in a public ceremony, with Sporus dressed as a bride. He supposedly kicked his pregnant wife Poppaea to death in a fit of rage. He built increasingly elaborate palaces and threw ever more extravagant parties while the empire strained under the financial burden. How much of this is true? It's hard to say. The sources for Nero's later years are particularly unreliable, mixing fact with gossip, rumor, and outright invention. What we can say is that Nero's behavior became increasingly erratic and self-destructive. Whether this was due to mental illness, the corrupting effects of absolute power, or simply the stress of trying to rule an empire while pursuing his artistic dreams, we'll never know. What's clear is that by 68 AD, Nero had lost the support of the very people who had helped him stay in power, the Praetorian Guard, the Senate, and the provincial armies. The year 68 AD started with rebellion. First in Gaul, where the governor Julius Vindex declared independence from Rome. Then in Spain, where Galba, the provincial governor, proclaimed himself emperor. Nero's initial response was surprisingly calm. He had dealt with rebellions before, and he had the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard and the urban population of Rome. But this time was different. This time, the rebellion spread. More troubling was the reaction in Rome itself. The Senate, which had been growing increasingly hostile to Nero's rule, began to openly discuss alternatives. The Praetorian Guard, whose loyalty had always been purchasable, started to waver. Nero tried to rally support with public appearances and promises of reform, but it was too late. The man who had once been beloved as a young reformer was now seen as a tyrant and a madman. By June 68 AD, it was clear that Nero's reign was over. The Senate had declared him a public enemy. The Praetorian Guard had abandoned him. Even his household servants were deserting him. In his final days, Nero fled Rome with a few loyal supporters. According to Suetonius, he spent his last hours rehearsing his own death, repeatedly practicing the phrase, "What an artist dies in me." On June 9, 68 AD, with his enemies closing in, Nero took his own life. According to the sources, he couldn't bring himself to commit suicide directly, so he had his secretary Epaphroditus help him drive a dagger into his throat. His last words, according to legend, were, "What an artist dies in me." Even in death, Nero saw himself primarily as a performer rather than an emperor. Nero's death marked the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty and the beginning of the chaotic year of the four emperors. But his legacy was just beginning to be shaped. The historians who wrote about Nero, Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, all lived under later emperors who had every reason to make Nero look bad. The Flavian dynasty, which eventually restored order to Rome, positioned themselves as the antithesis of Nero. Where he was seen as weak and artistic, they were strong and military. Where he was seen as self-indulgent, they were disciplined and practical. This created a powerful incentive to exaggerate Nero's faults and minimize his achievements. Every story that made him look bad served the political interests of the new regime. But the character assassination of Nero wasn't just political, it was also cultural. As Christianity became more influential in the Roman Empire, Nero's persecution of Christians made him a perfect villain. Christian writers portrayed him as the Antichrist, a monster of supernatural evil. By the time the Roman Empire became Christian in the 4th century, Nero's transformation from emperor to demon was complete. In recent decades, archaeologists have begun to uncover new evidence about Nero's reign. And much of what they've found contradicts the traditional narrative. Excavations of Nero's Golden House have revealed that it wasn't quite as extravagant as the ancient sources claimed. While it was certainly large and luxurious, it wasn't the monument to megalomania that historians described. More importantly, archaeological evidence from throughout the Roman Empire suggests that Nero's reign was actually a period of relative prosperity and stability. Public buildings were constructed, trade flourished, and the provinces were generally peaceful and prosperous. The evidence from Pompeii is particularly interesting. The city was destroyed by Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD, just 11 years after Nero's death. The preserved graffiti and artifacts from Pompeii show that ordinary Romans continued to speak fondly of Nero years after his death. One piece of graffiti reads, "Nero, they say you are dead, but I say you live forever." Another shows Nero depicted as a god. This suggests that whatever the elite thought of Nero, he retained significant popular support even after his death. Modern economic historians have also reassessed Nero's reign, and their findings are surprising. Yes, Nero spent enormous amounts of money on public works, games, and his own palaces. But he also invested heavily in infrastructure, trade, and urban development. The fire of Rome, while devastating, provided an opportunity for urban renewal that made the city safer and more prosperous. Nero's building programs provided employment for thousands of workers. His games and festivals stimulated the economy. His reforms of the legal system made commerce more efficient. The financial crisis that contributed to his downfall wasn't necessarily due to wasteful spending, it was largely the result of expensive military campaigns in Britain and Armenia, combined with the cost of rebuilding after the fire. In other words, Nero's reign wasn't the economic disaster that ancient historians portrayed. It was a period of investment and growth, albeit one that stretched the imperial budget to its limits. Modern psychology also offers insights into Nero's behavior that weren't available to ancient historians. Nero came to power at 16, an age when most people are still figuring out who they are. He was raised by an ambitious, controlling mother in an environment where violence and betrayal were normal. He had unlimited power from a young age, with no real checks on his behavior. Is it any wonder that he developed problems? The symptoms attributed to Nero, grandiosity, lack of empathy, impulsive behavior, need for constant admiration, are consistent with what modern psychology would recognize as narcissistic personality disorder. This doesn't excuse his actions, but it does help explain them. More importantly, it suggests that Nero wasn't uniquely evil, he was a product of a system that gave absolute power to individuals who were psychologically unprepared to handle it. Modern historians have also taken a much more critical approach to the ancient sources on Nero. Tacitus, our primary source, was writing 50 years after Nero's death under Emperor Trajan. He was a brilliant historian, but he was also a product of his time, with his own biases and political motivations. Suetonius was writing even later, and he was more interested in entertaining stories than rigorous historical analysis. His Lives of the 12 Caesars reads more like ancient tabloid journalism than serious history. Cassius Dio was writing 150 years after Nero's death, and his account is based on earlier sources that may or may not have been reliable. None of these historians were contemporary witnesses to most of the events they describe. They were working from earlier sources, oral traditions, and their own assumptions about what Nero must have been like. This doesn't mean we should dismiss everything they wrote, but it does mean we need to be much more careful about separating fact from propaganda, contemporary observation from later interpretation. So who was the real Nero? The truth, as always, is more complex than the legend. Nero was probably not the cartoon villain of popular imagination. He didn't fiddle while Rome burned, he wasn't even there when it started, and when he returned, he organized effective relief efforts. He probably didn't start the Great Fire, and his persecution of Christians, while horrific, was likely motivated more by political necessity than religious hatred. He was genuinely interested in the arts and may have had real talent as a performer. His love of Greek culture put him at odds with Roman traditionalists, but it also reflected the cosmopolitan nature of the empire he ruled. He was capable of effective governance. The first 5 years of his reign were genuinely successful, and even his later years saw significant achievements in public works and urban planning. But he was also deeply flawed. He was probably responsible for the deaths of his stepbrother, his mother, and his wife. He was vain, self-indulgent, and increasingly detached from political reality. His artistic pursuits, while admirable in themselves, distracted him from the serious business of running an empire. The real Nero was a paradox, a man capable of both great vision and terrible cruelty, of genuine artistic achievement and murderous paranoia. He was, in many ways, a typical product of the Roman imperial system, a system that gave enormous power to individuals who were often psychologically unsuited to wield it responsibly. But he was also uniquely himself, an emperor who dreamed of being an artist, who preferred the stage to the throne, who tried to transform Roman culture and was ultimately destroyed by the attempt. The tragedy of Nero isn't that he was a monster, it's that he was a human being with real talents and genuine interests who was corrupted by absolute power and ultimately destroyed by forces beyond his control. So why has the legend of Nero as history's ultimate villain persisted for so long? Partly, it's because the legend serves useful political purposes. Every generation of rulers needs examples of bad leadership to contrast with their own virtue. Nero provides a perfect foil, a cautionary tale of what happens when power goes to someone's head. Partly, it's because the legend fits our expectations of what an evil emperor should be like. Nero's combination of artistic pretensions, sexual scandal, and murderous violence makes him a perfect villain for our collective imagination. And partly, it's because questioning the legend requires us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, propaganda, and how history gets written. It's easier to believe in cartoon villains than to grapple with the complex realities of human nature and political power. The story of Nero offers several important lessons for our own time. First, it reminds us to be skeptical of historical narratives, especially those that serve contemporary political purposes. The winners write history, and they often have good reasons to make the losers look as bad as possible. Second, it shows us the dangers of absolute power. Nero wasn't born evil, he was shaped by a system that gave him unlimited authority from a young age, with no meaningful checks or balances. Third, it illustrates the complex relationship between talent and character. Nero may have been a gifted artist, but artistic talent doesn't automatically make someone a good person or an effective leader. Fourth, it demonstrates how propaganda can shape historical memory. The image of Nero fiddling while Rome burned is so powerful that it persists even when we know it's factually impossible. Nero's story also has modern parallels that are worth considering. Throughout history, we've seen leaders who combined genuine achievements with serious flaws, who were beloved by some and despised by others, who left legacies that are still debated today. The techniques used to demonize Nero, exaggerating his faults, minimizing his achievements, spreading scandalous stories about his personal life, are still used in political discourse today. The challenge for us, as for ancient Romans, is to separate fact from propaganda, to judge leaders based on evidence rather than reputation, and to remember that even the most powerful people are still human beings, capable of both greatness and terrible mistakes. In the end, Nero remains one of history's most controversial figures precisely because he defies easy categorization. He was neither the cartoon villain of popular imagination nor the misunderstood hero that some modern revisionist historians have tried to make him. He was something more complex and more human, a talented but deeply flawed individual who was given more power than any person should have and ultimately destroyed by the weight of his own contradictions. The real tragedy of Nero isn't that he was evil, it's that he was human. And perhaps that's the most important lesson his story has to teach us. The fiddle may be a myth, but the man behind the legend was real. And his story, of talent corrupted by power, of dreams destroyed by reality, of a human being lost in the machinery of empire, remains as relevant today as it was 2,000 years ago. When we look back at Nero, we're not just examining the past, we're holding up a mirror to ourselves and asking, what would we have done with such power? How would we have handled such pressures? And how will history judge us? These are questions worth asking, because in the end, we're all just people trying to navigate the complexities of power, ambition, and human nature. The scale may be different, but the fundamental challenges remain the same. Nero's story is our story, a reminder that history is made by human beings, with all their flaws and contradictions. And that's what makes it both tragic and beautiful, both cautionary and inspiring. The emperor who may or may not have fiddled while Rome burned has been dead for nearly 2,000 years. But his story lives on, constantly being rewritten, reinterpreted, and rediscovered by each new generation. And maybe that's the most fitting legacy for an emperor who dreamed of being an artist. His greatest performance is still being staged, night after night, in the theater of human memory. The show, as they say, must go on. And in Nero's case, it always has. So the next time someone mentions Nero fiddling while Rome burned, you'll know the truth. The fiddle is a myth. But the man? The man was far more interesting than any legend could ever be.